Okay, well, I think since we have everybody here, all of the sort of roundtable participants, and I'm sure we're going to get other people joining, I think I'll get us started because we're quite a few, and you know, time is of the essence. So I'm really going to be sort of mindful of that and try to keep us all as close to time as possible so that we have some time for discussion as well. I thank you all for coming, and especially across all of these different time zones, and especially sorry to everybody in the region for the lateness of this, but I'm so glad that we could still make it happen, even in the kind of difficulties of managing these different time zones. So hi everyone, and thank you to our small but hopefully growing audience for joining us today, whether it be, you know, the morning, afternoon, or evening for you. I'm really, really excited and honored to bring together what will hopefully be a great conversation around a wonderful and incredibly timely book, an edited volume by two of our roundtable participants. I want to start off just by sort of from a housekeeping perspective. I want to sort of flag that this roundtable was jointly organized by the APSA section and the Arab Political Science Network, and I want to thank, you know, the APSA team for being so helpful in kind of getting all of the logistical parts of this going and making sure that we have space for this on the program. So my name is Lama Mirad. I'm an assistant professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and I'm an executive member of the Arab Political Science Network, which is APSN. And I should quickly note also that we are recording this, and the participants knew this already, but for the audience, and we will be hopefully posting the video along with subtitles in Arabic in the near future. So you know, if you don't want to necessarily turn on your camera, you don't have to if you don't want to be recorded. But I'm really excited that we're going to also be able to offer this in Arabic. So once again, I'm really excited and happy to be chairing this discussion. And the big focus for us all here today is a co-edited volume by two of our roundtable participants. And we have one of the authors, contributing authors with us here today, Jeffrey Karam and Rima Majid, who are the co-editors of the book titled The Lebanon Uprising of 2019, Voices from the Revolution, which is currently under contract with IB Tauris and Bloomsbury. I know all of us are very excited to read the book in its entirety, hopefully in the near future, and we're delighted to be able to make some time today to discuss some of the chapters and the broader contributions of the volume, and hopefully have a conversation around the implication for the analysis of this for revolutions throughout the region and not just in Lebanon. So I'll start off first by introducing our participants, starting with the authors, followed by the discussants, who are really, I'm really excited, are some of the best people that I could think about to talk about some of these themes today. So thank you to the discussants for taking the time to read the volume. So first, we'll all be in different places on the screen, but so just wave when I name your name, hopefully, although everyone has their names underneath. But Jeffrey G. Karam is an assistant professor of political science at the Lebanese American University and a non-resident research associate at Harvard University's Middle East Initiative. Jeffrey is, of course, one of the authors in this volume and the co-editor alongside Rima Majid. He's also the editor of The Middle East in 1958, Reimagining a Revolutionary Year, which was also published by IB Tauris and Bloomsbury in 2020. And is currently finishing his first book on American intelligence and foreign policy in the Middle East during revolutionary times and political change. Rima Majid is an assistant professor of sociology and did not wave, but at American University of Beirut, and is both an author in this volume and the co-editor with Jeffrey Karam. Most recently, she has a fascinating article out in the journal Social Forces, which is provocatively titled In Defense of Intra-Sectarian Divide, Street Mobilization, Coalition Formation, and Rapid Realignment of Sectarian Boundaries in Lebanon. I really recommend you all check that article out. Roland Riachi is an associate researcher at the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration at the American University of Beirut and is currently based in Paris and is not a political scientist. And Rima is also a sociologist, but you know, outside a little bit of our disciplinary boundaries. His research topics include political economy and political ecology with an emphasis on environmental, water and development and food studies in the MENA region. Melanie Kamet, who's our first of our discussants, is Clarence Dylan Professor of International Affairs at the Department of Government and Director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She's the co-editor of a forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Politics in Muslim Societies, and even more directly related to the themes of this roundtable, has a co-authored article coming out very soon in Politics and Religion entitled Co-Ethnicity Beyond Clientelism, Insights from an Experimental Study on Religion and Political Behavior in Lebanon. Larissa Chomiak, who is to my right, is a political scientist and a director of the Centre d'études maghrébines at Tunis, an associate fellow at Chatham House in London, and co-founder with our other discussant, Jillian Schwedler, of the Sidi Bou Said School of Critical Protest Studies. She is completing currently a very exciting book manuscript titled Archipelagos of Dissent, Protests and Politics in Tunisia, and has a forthcoming essay in the APSA CP section on democratization in Tunisia that's I'm really excited to read. And finally, last but definitely not least, Jillian Schwedler is a professor of political science at Hunter College at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She is, with Larissa Chomiak, co-founder and co-director of the Sidi Bou Said School of Critical Protest Studies. And it seems very like all of these people independently I wanted to contribute in is her latest book forthcoming with Stanford University Press, which I'm also very excited about, in 2022, which is entitled Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent. So just to very briefly start us off today, I wanted to say a few words about the volume as a whole before turning to the discussants who are each going to be speaking about one of the chapters. First, I wanted to highlight the invaluable contribution of this volume as a sort of time and reflection capsule of a particular moment, and as the authors would say more accurately, a process in that Lebanon has been undergoing for almost 2 years now. And what I wanted to talk about, and Jeffrey and I started briefly speaking about before we officially started this conversation, is that in many ways, I feel like this volume is not just an encapsulation or a documentation of this process, but is part and parcel of, you know, the process of revolutionary moment and thinking in Lebanon. So in the introduction, we can see very clearly that this comes about partly through the authors themselves thinking through these things together, but also participating in these processes. So I think it's really important to highlight that. And this process that the authors are highlighting has been going on in Lebanon for almost 2 years now, but all started in many ways over the last decade. For me personally, as both a Lebanese citizen and a scholar of Lebanon that has been watching a lot of this unravel from afar, I can't emphasize both the awe that I have for putting together this amazing volume under increasingly difficult circumstances, but also the magnitude of providing these moments for those of us who were not able to be there, and the insights kind of garnered from that experiential process. And this is particularly the case, though not exclusively, in the section on testimonies and the chapters on particular sites of action, which give activists of many stripes, from the disability movement to lawyers and economists, as well as scholars, and recognizing that these are not mutually exclusive categories, the space to reflect on their lived experience of this particular period in Lebanon. And one thing I just wanted to highlight very quickly about this particular section of this volume, or some of the contributions here, and that I rarely have seen in volumes of this sort, is the inclusion of voices of those who were not quote unquote revolutionaries per se, but rather partisans, or regular citizens who may have actually wanted to maintain at least elements of this regime. So I'm very excited to read some of those chapters as it comes out. And in addition to this documentary component and sort of also sort of participatory element, which also has major theoretical contributions, of course, the volume also serves to challenge our understanding of success and failure of revolutionary moments, and integrates, as I've sort of alluded to a little bit already, the ways in which the study of revolutionary moments and counter-revolutionary processes need to come together. And the authors argue that in many ways they cannot be studied separately, which I think is interesting and something that we can think about and reflect on. And finally, just a while focused primarily on Lebanon, the volume also aims to place the revolutionary experience of Lebanon within regional and even at times global processes and moments, including the so-called Arab Spring, the more recent uprisings in Iraq, Sudan, and Algeria, but also Chile and Hong Kong, in what the authors refer to as revolts that can be defined at least in part by, and here I'm quoting, social conditions under neoliberalism that reinforce market tyranny, widen social inequalities and injustices, and block the possibility for actual democracy to emerge. So I think it's really interesting that, again, from a Lebanon scholarship perspective, it really takes this call to sort of de-exceptionalize Lebanon very, very seriously and integrate it within both regional and global processes. So I've already taken too much time. I will stop here and I will pass it on to the discussants to start us off, and then we'll come back to the authors for some reflections. So I'll go by alphabetical order, if that's okay, just to make it easier. So Melanie, if you would like to start us off, that would be fantastic.
Great, thank you so much, Lema, and thanks to Jeffrey and Rima for writing this book, and to everyone for including me on this panel. It's really a privilege to read an advanced copy of it, and I'm learning so much already. It really is an important volume. I think some of the general comments I wanted to make are points that Lema has already made, but I think there are so many dimensions of this volume that make it valuable. And reading the introduction, I get a sense of where it's going and what it's aiming to do. So, although I'm going to focus most of my comments on Rima's chapter, Sectarian Neoliberalism. Let me just say, in general, I think the in-depth material on the multiple dimensions of the Thawra is really valuable. And the fact, again, as Lema said, that we hear voices, or we will hear when we read the full book, voices of activists and participants and not just scholars, analysts, is really great. And of course, when you do include scholarly analyses, they tend to be written by scholars in Lebanon or from Lebanon, which is really great. And analytically, I think this treatment of the uprisings as a process really nails it. I too have been irked by this notion that there's a finite event called the Arab uprisings and that we can refer to them as failed. It's a really strange way of looking at the world. And I think you say in your chapter that, when we think about the French Revolution, I mean, this is not how things played out. People did not, maybe at the time someone said the revolution failed, but history will judge them. And so it's good that you're learning from history, and we should all learn from the way you're approaching this. I also appreciate the de-exceptionalization of Lebanon, which I think in so many ways is less and less exceptional in the region of the Middle East and perhaps vis-a-vis other places, in particular because we know that what historically differentiated Lebanon from other Middle East and North African countries is the relatively smaller direct role of the state in the economy, although I think people underestimated the role of the state in the economy. And the fact of the matter is the state has been really cratering in the rest of the region. So I think there's a lot to learn from Lebanon there. The one thing I wanted to ask, and maybe I missed it, is why the introduction doesn't mention the 2008 financial crisis. It starts with really by emphasizing the 2011 uprisings onward as an important moment that set off waves of global and transnational and certainly regional protests. But I think there's a longer lineage there. I mean, I suppose we could engage in infinite regress, but there does seem to be a connection to the movements that emerged out of the 2008 global financial crisis. So thank you for these important insights and the important framing that you've provided in this chapter. I look forward to reading the full book. So let me make some comments on Rima's excellent chapter, Sectarian Neoliberalism. I will send more detailed comments if they're useful. And I understand that the book is under contract, but is also it's still possible to make some revisions. So if you find any of these comments useful, I'm happy to discuss them further. I find also, the chapter as the introduction does, makes a valuable contribution to understanding this notion of revolutionary processes. And it does so by looking at both Lebanon and Iraq. Recognizing differences across the two countries, the chapter highlights parallels in the political economies of Iraq and Lebanon that make it fruitful to speak of social movements in the two countries in the same venue. And in fact, we can think of the notion of the Lebanonization of Iraq, that phrase, Lubnanat Iraq, that's been flying around since 2003, I think, in the region as sort of another way of anchoring this parallel. I really like the way that the process of revolution is depicted in this chapter. It's important, I'm quoting here, not to dismiss or downplay the role of these experiences as long-term processes shaping and transforming the political imaginaries of people in their everyday lives. I think that's an incredibly important point. I know we can't predict the future, so we don't know what people are going to do with these political imaginaries, but surely they have some importance in the way social mobilization plays out. The chapter does a nice job of highlighting what's different in the October 2019 protests that erupted in Iraq and Lebanon from prior contentious episodes. The fact that these protests clearly mobilized large components of society with class-based discourse, including people who had not previously mobilized, and some who had, had political allegiances, as the chapter states, to the ruling sectarian parties. That's really interesting, and of course, quite scary to the ruling sectarian authorities. The chapter points to potential cracks that have been created in the patron-client relationships in these countries. So a key contribution of the chapter, as the title suggests, is this concept of sectarian neoliberalism as the context within which the Iraqi and Lebanese revolutions are playing out. And so my major suggestions for the chapter are to sharpen this concept and to add more concrete empirical depths to the concept and to some other conceptual innovations or components of the chapter. So let me get a little bit more specific here, and I'll try not to take up too much time. So with respect to this concept of sectarian neoliberalism, I think it needs to be better defined. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I'm not questioning its value. It actually, on the face of it, makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not totally sure what it is. So there's parallels to the concept of racial capitalism in the sense that sectarian neoliberalism also relies on forms of social differentiation. But the difference is that sectarian neoliberalism is not necessarily based on a hierarchical relationship across groups. So in that sense, it's more egalitarian. I hate to use that word because there's nothing egalitarian here, but in terms of groups, group relations. The concept is premised on the notion that the two pillars of the regime, the sectarian structure on the one hand and the neoliberal economic system, are intertwined. But what I don't really get is precisely how are they intertwined? How do they work together? So I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And how is it that this sectarian differentiation can, quote, be useful for the development and maintenance of a neoliberal capitalist order? The other thing that was a little bit unclear to me, but that seems central to the concept, is the point that the relationship between these two pillars is intersectional rather than additive. So I just want to get a little bit more concrete about how these concepts play out on the ground. And there's some other dimensions of the concept that I think would also be useful to spell out. So for example, the fluidity of sectarian hierarchies. That's a key analytical point, but I'd want to hear more about how they're fluid. Is it because they're more or less politically salient in some historical moments or spatial contexts? Is it because there isn't a clear hierarchy of privilege by group? Maybe this article that's just come out in Social Forces delves into this more, and I'm excited to read that piece. The other thing I'd like to see more clearly specified is the role of patriarchy in sectarian neoliberalism. So how is it that sectarianism is founded on gender inequality? I mean, the most obvious thing that pops into my head is the way that religious / political elites have really kept an iron grip on things like family law, but maybe there's other dimensions as well. So another key analytical point of this chapter that, again, is very compelling, but I just need to understand it more, is the notion that there are internal contradictions of the revolution. The protesters focus on corruption, national unity, technocratic politics, individualism. And the point, I think, is that these are themes that come up in sectarian neoliberalism, but then are adopted by protesters. And you know, there's some compelling concrete points that make a lot of sense to me. For example, the focus on corruption effectively calls for reform of the system, but not a fundamental restructuring of the system. Just sort of throw the corrupt bums out and the thing will work better. But I think the point that that you're making and that some of the protesters, I think, would like is that the whole system itself needs to be radically restructured. It's not just a tinkering at the edges or a replacement of the characters in charge. I do find the discussion of individualism at the heart of sectarian neoliberalism a bit confusing. So there's a discussion of how the protests focus on some of the same themes that sectarian neoliberalism invokes. But then that makes me wonder, are these really features of sectarian neoliberalism? Maybe once the concept gets fleshed out a little bit more, that'll become clearer to me. But does sectarian neoliberalism really have an individualistic focus, despite the fact that at least one pillar of the concept seems to rest on groupness? So how does this concept reconcile the simultaneous emphasis on groupness and individualism? And similarly, the discussion of nationalism, especially of civic nationalism, is really interesting. So there seems to be a lot of rhetoric among protesters of a kind of calls for a more civic understanding of nationalism, but then there's a suggestion that this too is part of sectarian neoliberalism. So I'm trying to understand exactly what the critique is in this compelling claim that nationalism and sectarianism are not opposites. And I buy that. I mean, I find the effort to problematize the relationship between nationalism and sectarianism useful. And actually, I have a paper that's an R&R right now that does something similar with respect to people's preferences for security provision, where we show that people have simultaneous preferences for group-based security, but also a sort of more inclusive national-based conceptualization of security. And more generally, I wonder what nationalism actually means to people on the street and whether everybody means the same thing by it. And there's a hint that nationalism actually means different things to different people on the ground. So that could be developed further. More generally, how does the rejection of sectarianism by opposition groups resemble the rhetoric advanced by the proponents or upholders of sectarian neoliberalism? So I'm trying to understand, you know, what the parallels are in these claims when on the surface it seems that there's quite different political visions animating the sort of status quo elites and the people on the streets. So I think fleshing that out would be helpful. Just two more quick comments and then I promise I will be quiet. So another thing that I think would be really helpful here, and I know that you've done work on this elsewhere, so it shouldn't be hard, is to elaborate on the nature and sort of main characters in the protests and in the opposition movements. I'd like to know more about who these people are and what they want and what sort of the anatomy of the protests is. There's a really valuable discussion in the chapter on the discourse of protests in Iraq and Lebanon. But I'm wondering who ultimately shaped the discourse. Did it emerge organically? I doubt that it was entirely organic. Or were there particular leaders, movements, actors who helped to craft these slogans and demands? And more generally, why are these themes central to protester demands? Who shaped the discourse and who are the key actors at the center of protests? And there's a reference to schisms among the different elements of protesters or actors on the ground, and I'd love to hear more about that. There are some references to agents. For example, one sentence references leftist political organizations, unions, and syndicates, although the latter, I think, were co-opted in many cases. But there isn't really a concrete mention of who these actors are. Along these lines, I like this discussion of the NGOization of Lebanon. It reminds me of James Ferguson's arguments about the anti-politics machine of NGOs and developments in sub-Saharan Africa. But what is at stake here? Does this NGOization limit the ability of new political actors and agents to emerge and organize at the grassroots level? And what's at stake in arguments about how anti-sectarian political movements such as Beirut Medinati adopted an individual focus? Is it that their policy platforms were founded on individualistic notions of political change, or is there something about the rhetoric itself that had political force? So I'd like to understand more about how individualism plays into these movements, and more about why these anti-establishments or anti-status or alleged anti-status quo movements focused on individualism. I mean, one might think that it might also be a total lack of trust in the political system that's helping to shape this. And I think this really compelling point that the language of rights, quote, does not occupy a central space in the political imaginaries of people who've learned not to trust the legal pathway may be relevant here. I mean, to me, that's a really interesting claim. You could develop that in your own, a whole separate paper about how people that just don't trust legal pathways, don't feel that the language of rights resonates with them. So the final point I want to make is that there is a discussion at the end of the paper about how the framings of protesters are ineffective. And it really invites, to my mind, a bit more discussion about what appropriate framings and demands might be for the Iraqi and Lebanese context. I mean, obviously, you don't need to go and solve every problem and become the new organizer of all movements in all places, but it's at this point, it's very abstract. And I think it would be useful to hear more about how this sort of alternative axis of organizing, these new forms of organizing that you reference, I think in the penultimate paragraph, might play out, especially in light of Janine Clark and Bassel Saloukh's arguments about how unions have been so co-opted and so forth. Like, how is it that these new organizations are going to escape that fate and forge a potential foundation for an alternative political vision? Thank you. Great chapter, great book. I'm really delighted to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I think some of these questions will also hopefully be able to pick up on in the discussion, because I had some thoughts about that individualism element as well. Larissa Shomyak next, and and then hopefully we'll move on to Jillian.
Thank you, Lama. Just a quick note in case I'm on a mountain somewhere in the middle of Italy. So in case my internet goes out, Jillian has my notes written up, which is very likely. But I also I want to echo Melanie and thank you for including me. So first, to get the sneak peek read of this fantastic volume, and also for the invitation to comment. I structured my comments, so I have some ideas that might be a little bit, they're probably a bit repetitive, but I think it could be perhaps useful for Jeffrey and for Rima, and then I have specific comments on Roland's chapter as well, both of which I thought were absolutely fantastic. So the first thing that struck me was that this book is an important, I think Melanie mentioned it and you mentioned it as well, is an important departure from the kind of dominant decade-long uprisings literature that has broadly focused on the successes and failures of the uprisings, or for kind of like looking for the potential for any kind of political reform to take place in some way or another. So it's always tied to some kind of regime category and to see whether or not something can happen, something that's recognizable. So it was really refreshing to see a critique of it, and not just saying that this literature is, not particularly say interesting, but actually providing a framework for how to think of not just the last couple of years or the last decade, but the kind of more long durée thing. I really like how the individual chapters examine what the authors call revolutionary moments, to shed light on both the complexity of local struggles at different moments, and then link these to the regional as well as global political economic trends, particularly the insistence on predatory capitalism within a neoliberal context. So that was fantastic, and very clear. I also very much appreciated the discussion of why the anchor is Lebanon in October of 2019, when the Thawra erupted, following the kind of ecological disaster, the wildfires, in the context of the deepening financial crisis, and also a series of very unpopular government propositions. So this, the contextualization of that moment was very convincing, but at the same time, it was clear that the book is not just about October 2019, nor about Lebanon's political present, but rather the beginning of an investigation that begins in 2019, or opens the opportunity to think about other things that are going on. And of course, 2019 was the year of a renewed kind of global large-scale explosion of protests. I believe it was Time magazine that called it the year of protest. So there was something going on globally. And I think that this book is a contribution also to that kind of discussion of what was going on in 2019 and thereafter. Then the book scopes across issues, space, time, and gives the reader an incredible detail and analysis about the particular individual local struggles that the different authors, the different chapters address, but also include different tactics and strategies employed by revolutionaries routinely. So not just at the moment of heightened contentious, but on a day-to-day kind of basis as well. And I think that's a very novel kind of analytical spin on mobilization. So the book links the 2019 protest escalation to revolts of the past decades, but rather than reproducing a kind of decontextualized linearity of events analysis. So this happened in 2012 and 14 and 15 and so on. The individual parts all market force widened social inequalities, increased injustices, and foreclosed the possibility for more just, equal, if not democratic, political potential. And so the volume addresses the complexity that comes with and within resistance, protest, revolution, and social movements by examining specific issues or specific struggles in a global historical analytical framework. And again, I just absolutely loved that approach. So, as I mentioned in my first comment, the book departs from the success-failure arc, or the binary rooted in regime-type category approaches. And this arc defines so much of post-2011 political science work on the MENA. Questions such as, why did X country democratize but not Y? Why did X actors embrace democracy, whereas the same actors elsewhere did not? And I very much agree with the analytical frustration of that kind of bifurcation of extremely complex political events. That is not to say we should only study the complexity of one political event. So it's not that these questions of why one place is, why one case results in a particular kind of system is not uninteresting and unimportant. It's rather that approach has reduced an extremely large volume of contentious politics either as irrelevant, especially when related to formal institutions, or just simply too messy to study. And so I think that this volume is an important corrective to that. And I think this is in the words of the authors of the introduction, the individual chapters seek to capture the duality of both clarity and confusion that comes with revolutionary moment. I'm of course always thinking through the Tunisia lens. So what happened on July 25th was a moment of insane clarity and confusion and fear, and this kind of mix of emotions that is happening that this volume is seeking to capture. So I'm extremely excited about that. Now, one more point about the kind of broader contribution is that the approach looks at politics beyond the kind of linearity that has defined so much of political transformation, or the aftermath of revolution, how protest cycles are studied, and so on. And I think that this is perhaps a really interesting thing for studies of mobilization that kind of themselves have generated a very linear process, whether it's about events or actors or kind of volume of participation. So it really makes us think beyond that kind of linearity to consider other things that are going on, whether it's the routine, the longue durée, or just the kind of competing things that are happening at these moments. Okay, to Roland's chapter, which was my original mission. And I'm really excited that I've been asked to comment on the chapter titled "Filthy Flows of Power, a Political Ecology of Disaster in Lebanon." So the chapter places ecological struggles in the context of a powerful nexus of political business elites, but also into a hegemonic development narrative in which development organizations propose disaster relief and reconstruction programs that are disconnected from the more comprehensive struggles and demands put forth by citizens. Roland is especially attuned to the centrality of Lebanon's history of disaster and state-making, bringing together natural and social entities to theorize the evolution of relations of power. And I hope that if there is a chance to develop the chapter a little bit more, that part could be developed in more detail, as it's really innovative, informative, and theoretically almost radical, I would say. So this idea that what role does disaster, whether natural or man-making, play in the construction of state or state-making? The study has a number of examples of the interconnectivity between ecology, disaster, and predatory politics. But one of the most compelling contributions is thinking of ecological catastrophes as well as man-made disasters, not as local issues solely, but in light of existing national power relations that are connected globally. So this lends rich explanation to why and how such disasters in Lebanon are reproduced, maintained, and more rapidly multiplied. So here the idea is not treating kind of similar to in the introduction, that it's not about treating the moment as something that should be exclusively treated, or this fetishization of the 2011 uprisings, applying that same idea to disasters. It's not a thing that happens in a vacuum. It's enmeshed in these kind of broader, powerful networks, be they social or natural as well. Roland provides a powerful account of the processes and actors behind the privatization of public services around waste, water, and energy, and the resulting asymmetry of ecological destruction that occurs with this kind of privatization, and from which disasters, again, natural and man-made, erupt. Especially noteworthy are legal stipulations that buttress this kind of move, but also the resulting opportunity for what is oftentimes referred to as the ABCs of international disaster relief and reconstruction work by bilateral and multilateral organisms or global expert NGOs. And I think this is where it plugs into the kind of NGOization debate that is also growing. So if there's some more room for expansion beyond the state-making part that I thought was so fascinating, I would suggest to develop in more depth the rich sector-based analysis for the non-Lebanon specialist, and perhaps link the theoretical insight of thinking of these networks of power as neo-hegemonic practice and language to other struggles around natural resource protection, environment, climate change, water, and food sovereignty in the region, especially keeping 2019 and onward in mind. And so here, of course, I'm thinking of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, where these struggles are increasingly moving to the center stage of public protest. So they're not just to specific regions or to specific sectors anymore. Where citizen demands are linking into broader progressive and alternative political projects. The areas are phosphate, shale gas, and monoagriculture have been over the last couple of years, so since 2018, 2019, probably the sites of some of the most contentious political struggles. And then one final point, the discussion around the NGOization of social and ecological struggles as part of a dominant ideological reproduction with linkages to these powerful elites and the public works projects that become available, with the development language, in many ways frames, I feel, the multiple struggles that Roland, you're writing about in this chapter. So I thought that the NGOization with the development language is kind of a frame, and of course the connection to national powerful business and political elites is kind of the framing of the chapter. And I think that would help guide the reader a little bit more. But even as it is, it's fantastic. So it was a pleasure reading it. And thank you again for having me on this panel.
Thank you so much, Larissa. And, you know, I had a hunch that you would really, really like Roland's chapter, even just from the title, before I had the actual chapter in hand. So I'm really glad to hear that my hunch was right. And it's a fantastic chapter that I also really enjoyed reading. So last but not least is Jillian Schwedler, who will be commenting on Jeffrey and probably the volume as a whole as well, but Jeffrey's chapter. Thank you so much, Jillian.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody and the authors especially. I'm going to cut short my comments on the whole chapter because pretty much the things I wanted to say had been said. And I really love it. As I was reading the critique of the existing literature, I was like, yes, yes, yes. So I'm just super excited to see this come out. So I'll just leave that as that. So I was asked to give comments on Jeffrey Kedem's chapter, which is titled The Shadow Guardians of the Status Quo, the Lebanon Uprising of 2019, and the International Politics of Counter-Revolution. This chapter offers a rich and careful examination of the role played by external actors during periods of large protest and even revolutionary levels of mobilization. Much of the literature on authoritarianism in the Middle East has focused on domestic forms of repression, as he argues, evidenced in debates about resilience or robust authoritarianism, authoritarian upgrading, etc. So the chapter doesn't discount domestic repression, but it asks what role external powers play in enabling forms of domestic repression, and thus the maintenance of the status quo, by which he means keeping the pre-uprising political elites in power. In addition, the chapter promises to examine how, quote, affective and institutional aspects of status quo regimes could be employed to repress revolutions, unquote. Put differently, I think the chapter aims to identify and examine multiple techniques used by status quo elites with the aid of foreign powers to pick apart or weaken what Charles Tilly describes as the four necessary conditions for revolutionary mobilization, or WUNC: worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. So counter-revolutionary forces, domestic as well as external, might, for example, try to raise questions about protesters' worthiness, try to divide them, diminish their numbers, and so on. So the chapter then is broadening beyond the sort of focus at the domestic regime and its available techniques for repression, and making us think broader and larger, which is absolutely crucial. It's been one of my frustrations about the uprisings, is acting as if they're all these standalone units that have no connection to each other or to the United States or forms of, financial investment. So I was just like others, reading chapters going, yes, 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 yes. The empirical focus of the chapter is the uprising in Lebanon that began in October 2019, and the external powers are Iran and the United States. As Jeffrey puts it, quote, the conventional wisdom on counter-revolutions in Lebanon focuses predominantly on domestic factors, especially the sectarian foundations of the Lebanese polity and the formation of cross-sectarian alliances between the Christian and Muslim political elite that prevent fundamental changes to the existing political order, unquote. The chapter shows that Iran played, in fact, a major counter-revolutionary role in supporting Hezbollah, which itself alternated in its statements between characterizing the protests as Western supported and at other times saying they reflect legitimate socioeconomic grievances. This response was shaped by Iran's perception of Syria's uprising as a Western-inspired movement that would spawn terrorist groups. The Assad regime's violent repression of the protests therefore also provided a model for Iran, which provided Hezbollah military support for crushing protesters. Iran was looking to maintain its own power in the region or even to expand it, but the uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq in 2019 posed threats in that regard. In sum, as Jeffrey writes, quote, Iran's main objective as a counter-revolutionary actor in Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere is to maintain its strategic interests and political influence in the Middle East against the United States, Israel, and their allies in the region, unquote. The role played by the United States that he examines is also unsurprising in that it offers lip service support for protesters, but doubles down on support for existing allies, thus working to sustain the status quo, even as it grants this normative approval of protesters and their claims. US Secretary of State Michael Pompeo called, for example, for, quote, Lebanon's political leaders to urgently facilitate the formation of a new government that can build stable, prosperous, and secure Lebanon, and that is responsive to the needs of the citizens, unquote. Pompeo characterized the protesters as nonviolent and peaceful, underscoring the people's legitimate socioeconomic grievances. At the same time, the US fears about Hezbollah led it to continue to support the Lebanese armed forces, thus bolstering one of the very forces working to repress the protesters and maintain the status quo. US actions here mirror many other situations of lending discursive support to peaceful protesters, while in fact bolstering the very regimes the uprisings are seeking to change. So the chapter is just really well done in this regard. So my main comments and suggestions, as others, since we were told that you were welcoming to suggestions for how to improve it, my main comments concern therefore clarifying the theoretical argument, which is introduced but not always carried through carefully. At some points, it's not clear what the chapter adds that is theoretically new. For example, Jeffrey states that he's going to push against conventional accounts of the role of foreign actors in Lebanon, which he says, quote, suggests that regional and international powers support groups in Lebanon for power projection, strategic interests, both political and economic, and bargaining leverage in the Middle East and globally. But I think the empirical material presented and described as an alternative to that explanation actually conforms a lot to your presentation of that conventional account. So it shows that Iran is working to maintain and project its power, as is the United States, despite seemingly contradictory support for protesters in one instance and continuing support for status quo. It seems sometimes that the empirical material as presented can be accommodated within that conventional wisdom. So I'd love to see the critique followed through, clarifying really precisely where it does fall in line with conventional critique, which it does in places, but in other places it doesn't. So I think just sort of highlighting that. It doesn't have to be a wholesale rejection of the conventional wisdom, but rather the value added of what you're bringing forward. And then finally, the chapter promised to explore the affective aspects of status quo regimes, but what that means isn't really drawn out. And in fact, affect is not really discussed beyond the introduction. And I was really, really excited by this theoretical framework, the critique we've talked about already, but as well as the affective dimension. So I think the chapter could be strengthened by clarifying that. I'd love to see it brought back in, the question of affect. And again, just clarifying more precisely where you're building on existing arguments and where you're being more radical and pushing against them. So thank you for this. I'm so excited to read the whole book, and I'm going to be citing the hell out of it. Sure. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jillian. This is really exciting. And I mean, one of the main reasons I thought of you for that chapter was in particular the reflections on affect. So I'm glad to hear that you're sort of excited about seeing those pulled through, and I felt the same way. So in the interest of time, I'm sort of going to throw it to the authors to tell me what they would prefer. We can I can maybe reserve about 15 minutes at the end for you all to give kind of closing comments, because I want to do that anyway, and open it up kind of to broader discussion now. I have a few questions and also maybe some questions in the audience, or we can take some time now for kind of brief comments to if you have sort of immediate thoughts. Any preference?
Let's hear more, and then we'll come back at the end. And
perfect. Okay, so I'll make sure to reserve. Yeah, I'll make sure to reserve 15 to 20 minutes at the end that we can come back to you, because we obviously all want to hear from you. So I want to make sure we don't go through this all without hearing from you. So so I have a few questions that I'm happy to start us off with. And perhaps in that time, while we can get started, if members of the audience who are here, and some of whom I'm sure have a lot of thoughts and reflections, can put it in the Q&A box or the chat actually, because I don't think there's a Q&A function in these, and we can come back to them because I don't see any questions at the moment. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, or maybe raise your hand, and because we're a small enough group, and you can say them directly. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the discussants, but also thank you to the authors for really sharing with us this incredible and rich, contribution that is giving us a ton to think about. I'm totally mindful of the fact that, there are all of these these chapters are actually relatively short, right? They're not the chapters, and that allows the volume to have many voices, which I think is going to be a really strong sort of contribution also, just in terms of, again, coming back to that, bringing the breadth, not just sort of the same actors traditionally. So I'm also mindful that a lot of these comments may not be able to come into the book or into these particular chapters directly. One thing I had just in terms of a small kind of reflection in that mindset is that I felt that some of the sort of theoretical work around sort of the major kind of meta contributions of the volume could really live in the introduction, and then kind of not have to be repeated in some of the chapters, right? I felt like, particularly in both Rima and Jeffrey's chapter, like that, coming back to that contribution, I understand that it's helpful to have, standalone sections for that in every chapter, but in some ways they could be probably tightened and shortened, and then you'll have more space in those chapters, and then kind of referring back to the introduction, right? Sending the reader back to that discussion that can be more fleshed out in the introduction. I'm not going to give my comments on all the chapters. I'm happy to send them to the authors afterwards, but also integrate them into the discussion. But I loved reading all of the chapters that we got. So thank you all again. So I have a couple of questions. The first is really focused on the role that neoliberalism plays in this volume, because I think while it's most explicitly sort of named, I guess, in Rima's chapter, but also comes up in Ronald's chapter, I think it is really meant to be something that the whole volume speaks to. And so I would kind of want us to think a little bit about this. So the volume, particularly in the introduction, and again, as seen in both Rima and Ronald's chapters, makes a strong claim about the importance of neoliberalism and, quote, market tyranny in understanding the drivers of this revolutionary moment, not only in Lebanon, but also in Iraq and elsewhere in the world. What I found particularly interesting, and I'd love to get the thoughts of everyone on this, is also whether and how neoliberalism is also shaping the form that these uprisings take. And for instance, the way that groups can take shape, if at all, and whether it can help us also explain their susceptibility or potential opportunities that this provides to counter revolutionary forces. So I think, thinking through that will be something that's really, for me, was sort of one of the big questions coming out of this volume, sort of weaving through these core themes. And this doesn't just have to be in Lebanon, of course, in the context of Iraq. So I'll stop there, since that's the question, before I start giving part of my answer, and open it up. I can also put the question in the chat, as I do sometimes in the classroom, just to have it there as a Killian.
Hey everyone, yeah, thanks. This was a really interesting and exciting panel and roundtable, and of course I haven't read the book, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. Talked to Rima about it a little bit, and it just sounds like a fantastic contribution. So this question comes from someone who hasn't read the book, but just has listened to the discussion or the comments today. I'm really interested in the comparative aspect of this. I mean, I think this is something Rima, you and I have talked about this with Chantal as well, sort of trying to think about Lebanon in comparative perspective and thinking about what revolution looks like in the context of sort of flawed or broken or sectarianized or confessional democracy. Normally, when we think about revolution, we think about revolutions against autocratic regimes. And in that context, success is pretty well defined, right? I mean, it's sort of, toppling the dictator, right, is what success looks like. But it's very unclear what success or it's less clear what success looks like in the context of a sort of revolution in a flawed democracy. So I'm wondering if that's something that this volume speaks to or something you all have opinions on. I think it's particularly relevant in light of the sort of the wave of uprisings in 2019, many of which actually did target sort of broken or flawed or neoliberal democracies that haven't lived up to their promises, which is really not something we've seen in a lot of previous waves of revolution. And so I think Lebanon potentially can be an interesting case for trying to make sense of what that looks like and what success looks like in those contexts.
Thank you, Jillian. I think that actually, yeah, that feeds really well into this broader discussion as well, right? Into perhaps not only is it shaping the form that, you know, the resistance takes, but also has to have us reevaluate how we think about success, right? Because the sort of target is different. Jillian?
Yeah, just following up on the question about neoliberalism, how it affects protests and vice versa. I'm currently afflicted with I just finished a book, and so that's all I can think about, disease. But one of the things I examine in my book, and I'd love for you guys to do this, it might be more than you want to do, but is thinking about the ways in which neoliberalism like restructures the built environment, and therefore thinking about where and how people protest in those built spaces. And then where and how the government wants people not to protest in certain spaces because they're trying to advance certain kinds of projects, but you can protest elsewhere. So just bringing in that sort of spatial built environment component of it can sometimes, I think the direction you guys are pushing, which I absolutely love, might help, you know, and not just neoliberalism, thinking about the port and what hasn't happened with the port since that happened and how that affects protests, and then how states respond in part based on where people are protesting. So I think that can give you a piece of kind of where Lemma was nodding towards that might be helpful. And I would love to read it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just thinking kind of off the cuff, building on what Jillian said, I think thinking about the spaces of decay that were taken over in a way, in that, so sort of particularly, you know, I'm thinking of like the egg and, you know, all of these spaces that became sort of sites of reappropriation. And but, you know, what do they tell us also about, you know, the retreat of the state, what was considered worthy of maintenance, what was not considered worthy of maintenance, and for, you know, what for potentially, you know, not just potentially for capitalist reasons, right? You know, there are spaces that were monetized and sort of made to be worthy of investment, and others that were left to sort of, and I think it's interesting, and I don't think it's a surprise that it's those spaces that then became major sites, right, of galvanization and of mobilization. You know, I remember seeing the videos of you know, the Mejal happening in these spaces of decay, right? So I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's there, right, in the book. It's just.
I'll jump on that, since, yeah, that's very interesting, but I'm thinking it's interesting that you call them spaces of decay, because what I had in mind was also access to one of the main sort of battles, right, during the uprising, but also in 2015, and in many waves of mobilization, was to just physically be able to protest in front of the parliament.
Mm-hmm.
There's no access to the parliament physically, right? It's the space is closed. And, you know, if we're thinking about taking over those spaces of decay, like the egg and those other buildings, but also, you know, the beach, or the different hotels and etc.
Yeah.
That were also sites for mobilization. But it's interesting to also think of this parliament building as a space of decay, and what it means in that sense. I think, I don't know if you want me to reply to other points, or if we can continue.
Honestly, it's whatever's, you know, I was hoping to kind of open up a bigger discussion. Like for me, you know, maybe Melanie, we can kind of build on some of what Melanie was asking about. So for me, this question also, in addition to some of the thoughts that Jillian sort of also made me, you know, I wasn't actually thinking spatially, but now I realize how this question also can be understood spatially. And the book has that. I was also thinking about this kind of claim that you make in your chapter, Rima, about the sort of individuation sort of the fact that, you know, potentially neoliberalism also shapes, you know, how the claims become individualized and not, and maybe that allows you to speak a little bit to some of Melanie's comments as well, because it is sort of there in the chapter, right? But as I was reading it before I got to the section where you cite lihaki, I was like, well, what about, yes, Beirut Madinati, but what about also lihaki, which is more, I would say, generally understood as not as neoliberal, I would say, and it's which I think is an important kind of intervention that you're making there. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I want to start by thanking Melanie for the very thorough comments, and I'd love to have them in writing and engage more with them and thinking about. But you definitely poked my mind on several things, and I think specifically this question that I totally agree. I need to elaborate a bit more. Now, there's always the trouble of the word limit, right? So Jeff and I played the good cop, bad cop against each other. And so he forced me to cut from my chapter and I forced him to cut from his. Both chapters started as more than 10,000 words and we had to cut down. And probably the notion of sectarian neoliberalism, I agree. And I was telling Lema yesterday that when I reread the chapter after some distance, I realized that it's not very well fleshed out. And it's probably because I'm working on a book on that. So in my mind, the concept is clear, but probably I need to write it in a clearer way. So that's definitely something, sharpening that concept more is definitely something I want to do in this chapter. But the one thing that I found very interesting and that I definitely need to think more about and engage with in your comments, Melanie, is this idea of the two components of sectarianism that is presented as a communal project or community-based, and neoliberalism that is always tied with this idea of individualism. And I think that it's definitely something that needs to be unpacked a bit more in this chapter. And from previous work I've done, I would now very quickly say that I think that sectarianism, in as much as it looks like a communal project, it is, and the claim I'm making is that it's not sectarian and neoliberal. It's the intersectional aspect of it is that it's sectarian neoliberalism. It's both, that they co-constitute each other somehow, right? And it's a broader argument I'm making elsewhere about how the Lebanese system from the very onset has been a neoliberal system, right? The literature on neoliberalism starts with Chile in the 70s, but my claim is that it started in Lebanon, or at least some aspects of what neoliberalism is, started in Lebanon from the very onset with Michel Chiha and how he understood or how he portrayed, this Lebanese project. So, and in that sense, one can play a lot with this line of thinking and what it means and more globally, right? Sometimes I think maybe Lebanon is the future of the world, and this is all going to collapse in an ugly way as it did here. But it's this idea that, it's based on differentiation, it's institutionalized in some cases, not in others, but also you're very right to say even the gendered aspect of it goes beyond just personal status law. And to me, the whole new capitalism is gendered. It relies on the care labor that women do and, all these other aspects. So probably this needs to be fleshed out more, but I want to thank you for pushing me to think about these two pillars together. And also this, I'm excited to read your piece on nationalism as well. And to me, or theoretically, sectarianism is a form of nationalism. But I'm happy to also talk more about this, maybe not in the chapter given the space limit, but in other work. I'm sure, this book, when we thought about it at the beginning, both Jeff and I were thinking that this is the beginning of a discussion that we want to have with the people we've invited, but also with a broader audience and beyond just Lebanon. But we both lived very intensely those moments, and we both felt that, now that things have calmed down in the street, and we found ourselves wanting to think more about what happened and to make sense of it, but also not from the lens of just Lebanon, but also acknowledging that there are these global processes, there are regional dynamics, and there's been uprisings, in many other places. And what do we learn from history, but also from, comparing with and connecting with scholars and activists and militants and journalists elsewhere. And we also did not want it to be just scholars, and this is why the book is constructed the way it is. The question about the importance of neoliberalism, the critique, I wouldn't say, a critique, but I think from a very generous place. Many of those activists, whether Beirut Medinati or Lihaqi or others, are my friends and my comrades and people I really respect and cherish. But I think it's an attempt at, and these are things I've discussed with many of them, but I think, neoliberalism plays a central role, and what links what is happening to Lebanon with what is happening in other places in the world is one of them is definitely neoliberalism. Now, in the context of Lebanon, it was very clear that this is probably the only uprising in the region that clearly kicked off for socioeconomic reasons. Very clearly from the onset. People were talking about the governor of the central bank and politicians as one. So that moment at the beginning made it very clear that politics and economics are not separated. At least in this liminal moment of the beginning, it was clear to everyone that they're one, this is one class or one group or one, category in society that we're fighting against. But also what these processes of neoliberalization mean in terms of how you shape activism. And I think in my chapter, I was trying to talk a bit, what I had at the back of my mind, I can't remember if I mentioned him in the book or not, in the chapter or not, but it's Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism. And this idea that we live in a world where we're unable to even imagine anything beyond capitalism. So even our most radical political imaginaries are so shaped by capitalism itself. And these are the contradictions that I was trying to, it was good. Of course, the intentions of people were to change, but what kind of change and what direction and what is it that we can imagine beyond this reality seem to be always constrained by the very reality itself, right? So it creates those contradictions whereby, individualism becomes very predominant, and the examples I give from Lebanon or Iraq, but also, so I think what I was doing in this chapter is an invitation to unleash our political imagination and try to imagine something different. That even so, our references or our framing are very much tied to a modern world that does not seem to always match the realities we're living, right? Such as this whole legal aspect. That I'm not saying it's not important. Of course, legal activism is important, but it ties us to limits that I think, for a revolutionary break to happen, we need to even break those limits and be able to imagine something beyond just going to court, right? Like a different type of change. And the question of Killian that I think is linked, but is also interesting, is about the comparative aspect of what does Lebanon offer in the sense that, so Lebanon and Iraq are the two cases in the region that did not have an autocracy, which makes it more complicated to think of what the success is, right? It's not just toppling one person. But I think what we can, or what is important in those cases is that it actually gets us to stage 2, right? So what we see in Tunisia, what we see is that the first stage was to topple a person, and then the actual struggle really begins on, and this is where you see that the shape that protest takes or revolutionary moments take under neoliberalism is that you have an outpour of millions in the streets, but you don't have the strong organizations or a clear political alternative or political project. And this is where success becomes more difficult, because they all don't want this, but they all want different things. And so it becomes a struggle of a different form. In Lebanon, I think, we kind of jumped a bit, we don't have one, we have 6 men, and we can add to them, the governor of the central bank, so there's 7 men. But beyond those 7 men, it's also about, changing the whole thing. And this is where we see today the divisions between those who want to run for elections and want to reform from within, or those who are saying, it's the taif is done, we need a complete shift, or those who are saying, the problem is the way with the economic structure. And so I think we're open to all of these debates, and I think we're in this very long and difficult revolutionary process that might end up in reproducing more tyranny or not, but that has definitely started, in my understanding. Mm-hmm. So I'll let Jeff maybe add more.
So this is great. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Lama for organizing this, and thank Melanie, Jillian, and Larissa for actually taking the time to read the chapters, and the comments are really helpful. It's really different to hear, to begin with, hearing through of you praising what's important about the book, right? Because we've been so close to it for a long time. Lama and I began this discussion, so I'm just going to spend a minute just going over a bit of how this came about. So we had our first panel on discussing what's going on in Lebanon at Meza in November 2019. And it was very weird to come back from the street, go to Meza, and break all the conventions regarding, should I be wearing a suit or not? Should I be doing this or not? And we ended up actually having more discussions, which always happens at Meza, in the around the bar than actually within the panel room.
And so over po' boys as well. Exactly. And over po' boys in Jeff. Sandwiches.
I would say just one fast thing, and before I can dive into other comments, because I hope to collect more reflections from everyone. I think one underlying feature of the book that we experienced in the street that we have not fleshed out really has to do with the ceiling of our imagination at the beginning of the uprising, which actually was defeated, if we're going to use the language of success and failure. The government, the regime, the pillars of the system, if you're thinking about banks, if you're thinking about the Lebanese armed forces, if you're thinking about political parties, part of this neoliberal tradition is to provide spaces of contestation, right? To provide us with wiggle room that we own the streets, we own the classrooms, but in reality, from the very first day, our moments of mobilization were still limited. And when I say by limited, when Ria mentioned the idea about the parliament was blocked up from the first day. So it was a big no-no in where we can actually organize and what we can mobilize. And then the counter-revolution began on the same evening, but it really got deep 3 weeks in. But within these 3 weeks, the government was actually smuggling what remained of US dollars and reserves in the banks. So it was really a great space for us to vent off, attack different stores, do what we would characterize as the euphoric moment of this outburst of hope in the earlier weeks of this revolutionary situation. But it was always clear to us, to a certain extent, and I say this with the vantage point of hindsight, that this order creates this illusion that we have multiple voices in the street. At least there's some understanding that it's no longer the I, it's really about the we. But when it comes down to it, these are from the very initial meetings that we were holding with different groups and what to think about the alternative. No one really wanted to talk about the alternative. So we only want to talk about how this is leaderless and how the civil war, quote unquote, has ended, how people are going for the first time to Tripoli and experiencing something new. All these stereotypes are not, no one's going to kidnap them there, or they're going to see Salafis everywhere in town. All these stereotypes were part of this revolutionary magic, right? But it also, if we fall into that trope of thinking of what did that achieve or not, this is where we can go back to Killian's point regarding, well, the success to a certain extent was being able to think about how intersectional these issues are, but without saying it on paper, but actually through the lived experience. And the lived experience of it having people get out of their bodies in terms of thinking about LGBTQI rights, for instance, was something new. And when I say something new, it's for partisans to be in the street and be able to see women chanting, right? Leading the demonstrations was not something that many were accustomed to. So maybe that's a small outlier that we did not highlight, but it's one of the things that I think Rima and I, Roland, and others that were in the street felt was revolutionary on its own. So it was a win for us to be able to experience that on a daily basis, rather than just thinking about, well, the regime is going to be, are we going to be able to revamp it? Are we going to be able to reform it? So much of the processes argument that we had in mind, and in the book, we are constrained by how much we're going to go into this personal reflection and still be able to make a clear theoretical contribution, was really trying to think about wins and failures and successes, not as a sort of experience that we saw in the first 2 days. Because if you want to talk about failure, one could think about the evening of October 17. That was the first evening when people started to be repressed and started to be arrested and were tear gassed. And there are videos and pictures that show that this moment could have been defeated from the very first hour, but it pushed through. Why did it push through? This is in part how, like, for instance, Mona Harif's chapter about spaces and urban activism touch on these types of contestation. Or Sanat Nouri's Kalam's chapter on the theater of Lebanon, basically, in different phases of how it became a space, as Lama was saying, for people to organize around, how it was a space that people were denied access to during the Civil War, and how we reclaimed that space. But it's also important to keep in mind that much of the discourse about reclaiming, recapturing, also gives the sense of the I, that we were able, and much of the campaigns, which is like Ana Khat Ahmar, for instance, some of the campaigns really showed how much there's a vested interest in what can this group achieve from this moment, while many in the street were trying to think about, well, are we going to be able to have a broader discourse, right? And what that broader discourse was is something still to be debated. But again, when we are thinking about this moment, whether it begins or ends, and if you want to compare it to, we had one autocrat to deal with, in many ways, I think it's not only the 6 or the 7 that Rima mentioned, but also what comes with the 6 or 7. And sometimes the counter-revolution began with people within our own circles, right? Convincing them that it's not about elections or having, like many of our friends, Rima and I talk about this a lot, had full lists for cabinets, right? They had full lists of who's going to be Minister of Environment, Minister of I don't know what, and they were happy to go to the regime and say, you're giving us the space because the president at some point in time invited the revolution, quote unquote, the revolutionaries to come to the palace and discuss. And apparently within days, some of our friends had lists of people that should run for office. And we wanted to reconcile that with the bigger idea of, well, what does this mean in practical terms, right? Are we reforming the system? Are we keeping it as is? So we can go more and more about that, but I just want to highlight the idea of writing about this, like really inviting scholars and activists and thinking about this from the perspective of writing it during crisis with all the reasons in the world why this could be a failed experiment, right? It's very easy to be able to think about COVID-19, think about the August 4 explosion, think about the economic recession right now, and also think about how the government creates these crises and comes in to solve them, and the kind of social normalcy that people are trying to relive right now. And if we think about that, that is a sense of defeat that really makes this book a bit dated, if we think about it from that perspective, right? But we're also trying to send out a message of hope that we can't think about 1917 in Russia without thinking about the failure in 1905 to a certain extent. And I can go on and on with examples from now to the end of time. But in the case of Lebanon, what's exceptional about this moment is really being able to create thoughts, not only for the sake of the book, as Zira mentioned, but also beginning the discussion of we are experiencing a moment where there are lots of, like, I would say pain, but also hope. When we were chanting in the street from Beirut to Baghdad or to all other places around the world, which really shows that to a certain extent, maybe we're not going to call it the failure of neoliberalism, or the failure of modernization, or the failure of development, or the failure of these promises that are going to create opportunities for all. But generally speaking, in the street, this was felt, and people called it different names. So when people said Thawra on the first evening, many of the press outlets were, oh, protest, some people are on the street, they're hijacking the banks, but we committed to the idea, and Rima and I put that introduction on purpose to be able to say that maybe it's not a thawra because it doesn't have all the aspects of what an actual revolution should be, but it's also one that we're not going to deny the agency that people have when they want to label what they're experiencing and what they're feeling in the street. And to many of them, this was an actual revolutionary moment. And in a way, this is something we're hoping to highlight. So the comments from everyone, and Jillian, thank you a lot for the specific ones on my chapter. And again, this is a problem where the chapter is 11,000 words. And the idea of affect is so close to my heart because I think a lot about discourse and emotions when it comes to really understanding.
I'm super sorry, Jeff. I hate to cut you off, but I want to make sure, just because we have 9 more minutes. I'm so sorry, Jeff, because I really want to make sure I want to give some time to Roland. And then hopefully we can, I'm sure this sort of will, we have an email thread going too, so we can hopefully kind of come back to. So I just want to make sure that we give some time to Roland before we end. Roland, if you have any thoughts and comments, just sort of on a broader discussion. And
hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, I would like to thank you. Thank you, APSA. Thank you, Jeffrey and Rima, for having given me the room actually to write this chapter. It was a great pleasure. It was a very difficult task actually to talk about ecology broadly in an exhaustive way, at the same time concise to 4,500 words. Getting back to Larissa's command that I should maybe do a comparative with other ecological movements in the Arab world, which is something quite difficult, but actually it is part of my research agenda. I'm having an article that will be published soon in Journal of Agrarian Change, which is called Manufactured Regional Scarcity, the MENA region under global food regimes. So here I will talk a little bit more, and actually it draws a little, I will draw some lines with what was discussed until what Jeffrey was saying, is that actually we're living in a moment, but it's a global moment of neoliberal crisis, neoliberal failure, but there's a transition that is happening maybe since what Melanie referred to, the monetary crisis. Now we're dealing with a post-COVID crisis. We're waiting at any moment that the Fed raises the interest rates and we see something new drawing worldwide, I think. So yeah, there's something happening with neoliberalism. Actually Lebanon gives a great example of what might be a dollarized economy collapsing. So we're getting back to what is Bretton Woods, the collapse of Bretton Woods and the post-Bretton Woods collapse, perhaps. Or there's something actually worldwide and getting back to there are not only local crises that are happening, but I would like to call them global ones because they have their global actors, dimensions, and they do have their local experiences, getting back to experiences what Jeffrey actually was saying. Something I would like to add to the general discussion is that maybe it's something I trimmed actually. I have, and out of this chapter, I developed maybe something that goes double and that I even had to trim to cope with what was requested. But I made the discussion actually between, well, actually, if we look at Occupy Wall Street, if we look at Indignato in Spain, well, people refer to what is neoliberalism as neoliberalism, which is not the case for an Egyptian or a Tunisian. He won't say, well, this is neoliberalism. Maybe there's something, well, it's not myopic, but well, there's a subsidy, there's a state, there's something that is moving, but they don't call it neoliberalism. It's not actually the work of, well, educating people that we're living under neoliberalism, but it's the era that we academia maybe agree on, but which is not the case of people Lambda or a person Lambda on the streets in Beirut. So this is, I think, also to think about. And something related also to what Jeffrey was saying is that also I actually wrote three chapters of the programs out of 10 of Beirut Madinati. So and maybe I like mentioning them as liberals today is a bit like heart aching, but it's the case. Actually, what is left are actually liberals. And it was a very tough exercise to deal with those when I was working with them for the campaign. So there's a very important point, I think. Is it a velvet or a radical revolution? So this like characteristic is something that one must give in any revolution. Is it a velvet one? Was it trying to change things through in the playground of the system? For example, running for the elections, under what law? Why wouldn't be today a mobilization against the upcoming electoral law? Why wouldn't be, no, this law does not represent us, and mobilize again around those terms? Actually, I left Lebanon in September 2019, so 1 month before the revolution. I'm a virtual participant of the revolution, but I had the chance to go a couple of times and be there on the ground. But when I was in September, I actually carried with me a consultancy from the ILO and the Central Administration of Statistics. So I was writing at the same moment of the revolution the living household conditions and labor force in Lebanon. So, and I was watching a lot in numbers of what's actually happening in the ground. For example, 72% of Lebanese families before in 2019 used to live 72% with less than $1,200. So yeah, those were huge numbers that are there, and that were actually telling me something. And something quite very important, and now that we're witnessing, is actually the 25, 64 years old in Lebanon. I don't know, I'm gonna try to share now. It's something that is unpublished actually, but I'm gonna try to share this figure with you. Can you see it? Yeah, so we can see the squeeze. So we call it's a clear squeeze at 25, 64 years old. Those are people that are meant to be part of the active labor out there. So this is in 2018, 2019 survey. And we see this at the national level. And I'm wondering today where we are in this squeeze. So a revolution without its youth, it's something also quite telling. Why is it a success or failure? But there's a huge component there that actually there's no youth in Lebanon anymore. And more of that, something I experimented a week ago when I was in Beirut, is that I was really happy when I saw a child. Frankly, it was very rare to see a child. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rima and Jeffrey, but it's very rare to see like children around, playing around. And this is really, I don't know, it's maybe beyond people, or maybe some discussion were saying it's the collapse of a society. Well, maybe now we're living into something like that actually in Lebanon, where now those few youth are maybe the kids or of those that are elder, but those are also prominent people to leave the country. So so I would like maybe to stop on that we have actually some components that are missing in the analysis. And something also quite I would like to stop on is actually well, this is also to respond to what Lama was asking, actually how does neoliberalism form those struggles? Well, it deforms it, it tames civil society, well, and also at the same time the discursive in Lebanon. So we tend to say, for example, well, there's over-hiring in civil servants positions. And I would say, tell you a number. There are actually 5,000 out of 25,000 civil servants in Lebanon at 59 years old average age. So there are around 80% of vacant positions. So there is no public services anymore in Lebanon. But at the same time, we see that 120,000 armed forces are being also paid by the government. But we may point on corruption made by old administrators, but we forget to see the bigger picture, which actually I would call it maybe to add to what Rima, like dual it's actually an authoritarian neoliberalism with a huge part of its budget going actually to the army. It's around 40% of the budget, which is a huge, and this is something that is some kind of maybe silent in the discussion today and previously also.
Amazing, thank you, Roland. I might ask you to stop sharing, and
yeah,
then that
sure,
way we can see each other all in.
Yeah,
but thank you so much for that, and especially giving us kind of the preview of published data on Lebanon, which already is so data scarce. So that's really, really interesting, right? Because it's different than the sort of traditional age pyramid that we see in the region, right? It's a very different. But I was thinking about your last reflection is sort of a great way to sort of, so much of the discussion around Lebanon, of course, is generally about sort of the weak state. Where is this, what is the state? And in some ways, this is the sort of your invocation to like, the claim of when الدولة, like, الدولة is in a very specific area, right? It's a very specific and
it's actually strong also with like,
exactly.
When you talk about 120,000 armed forces compared to maybe 1 million man, so we're talking about 12% of active labor working in armed forces, so which is huge.
For us today, when you say dawli, it means electricity. So people now ask each other, is it a dawli?
Yeah.
Generator, or is it the electricity?
We always used to say that.
The concept of dawli keeps on changing and morphing into new things.
It's so true, yeah. But I definitely remember that even like, from years ago, Bijnoub, where because of the lack of electricity for so long, is it dawli or ma is the dawli, right? But that's, I don't think there's a moment to end on. I think there's so much to think about, and I wanted to just end by first thanking everyone and for such a great discussion, and really to invite us all to continue this conversation. I know that I will be sending comments, and that hopefully we can have more of this. The second is that we do hope at APSN to hold another conversation around this volume with hopefully another set of authors as well, and in Arabic. And so sort of stay tuned for that. And then the other thing is to note, when I said earlier, like the timeliness of this volume, but also the timeliness of this conversation, we're not even a couple of weeks, we're a week away, a couple of weeks away from the sort of 2-year mark of the beginning of the Thawra in Lebanon. And so there's a lot it's both a very long time in Lebanon in terms of just the massive transformations that have happened, and also in some ways such a short time, right, for us to think about all of this. And often we have so much more time and hindsight, right, to reflect on these things. So it's incredible, again, to echo what everyone has been saying, that just the sheer amount of reflection and work that's happened and is present in this volume in a very, very short period of time. So thank you all so much. And Andrew Stinson has told me that we can go a few minutes over the normal time. So thank you so much. And I look forward to picking up this conversation again, hopefully. Take care.